Welcome to Bounce, the podcast where we dive deep into the world of product teams, the challenges they face, and the incredible stories of resilience that emerge. I'm Mollie Cox, your co-host, a product designer with a knack for navigating through the storms of creativity.
And I'm your co-host, Claire Flowers, a product manager who's seen it all. The highs, the lows, and everything in between.
Each week we'll bring you tales of product traumas, those moments that test our limits, they push our boundaries, and sometimes bring us to our knees.
We're talking about career flops and follies and those pivotal moments when everything seems to fall apart.
But as we know, the harder you fall, the higher you bounce. We'll explore with our guests their toughest challenges,
The actions they took to overcome them.
and how these experiences have shaped their careers and continue to impact them today.
So join us in this journey of resilience, growth, and bouncing back stronger than ever.
Well, welcome to Bounce. I am Mollie Cox, your co-host, here with Claire Flowers, who is also the co-host. Today we have with us, I'm so excited about this episode. Today we have with us Rachel Lindsay, who is a recruiter in the tech space, specifically in product recruiting. I have had the opportunity to work directly with Rachel, and I have to say, that was the dumbest word to use, is the most badass recruiter I have ever worked with in my career. Rachel has over 10 years of experience recruiting, and she has done a wide range of roles. Also in SaaS, she's recruited engineers, product, go-to-market. She's worked in cybersecurity, global banks, healthcare. So just has run the gambit of things. She's hired in Canada and all 50 states across the US. So super excited to have you on the show, Rachel. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I could not believe you asked me to come on.
Well, I think right now, and Claire, I think you can agree, one of the hottest topics is recruiting, right? And it is one of the questions I get asked about the most. I mentor a lot of different designers. Claire, I know you talk with product managers all over the place. And inevitably, especially with how the market space is right now, it's the hot topic. So, again, why not bring on the most badass recruiter I've ever worked with and let's talk about it, right?
Awesome.
So Rachel, just to kick us off a little bit, I would love to hear about kind of your journey just a little bit, how you found yourself in tech recruiting, and what this landscape has kind of, the evolution you've seen in the last several years. It's very different than it was 10 years ago.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I can't really speak to 10 years ago because I haven't been in it too long. I would say probably.
Don't age her, Mollie.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Do you want me to say my age out loud? That way we'll all feel better. Okay.
I started in cybersecurity. So historically I was recruiting everything else that was like business professionals, like accounting, paralegals, all kinds of stuff like that. And then I had a friend who was at a cybersecurity firm, and he was like, put in a good word for me, which is how pretty much I've found every job that I have, which is what we'll talk about in a little bit. But he put in a good word for me. So I got hired on there, and it really elevated my career to get into cybersecurity. It was so niche. So we were recruiting for all types of huge organizations globally. So it was a lot of fun and very, very challenging. So that was where I really had a need and a want and a huge desire to like really understand the roles that I was recruiting for and not just kind of like wing it, because like those candidates know when you're winging it. So that's why I was like, okay, moving forward, I just really need to dig in and understand these recs. And then I got recruited over to Grin, which I was happy where I was, but someone on LinkedIn was like, hey, if you have an experience what your candidates are experiencing in this market, you should probably apply for a job. So I did, and I applied to Grin, and then they hired me.
Well, that's pretty amazing. Like that's kind of my Grin story that we'll talk about in a little bit, but yeah.
So I had a great experience interviewing with my manager, and he was like, you don't have any internal experience. Would you want to be internal? Because the difference is when you're working external, you have lots of different priorities. You have tons of different clients. And so if one's not being communicative or you're not getting traction on one, you can just focus on another rec. And that's not how it works internal, because you're responsible for that rec until it's filled. And so that is the biggest thing he wanted to make sure I was comfortable with before I came over. But once I got to Grin, that was really monumental also for my career. Another elevated point in my career was just really understanding holistically the organization and how all the roles really interacted with one another. That was something that I didn't have a lot of exposure to in my prior experience. So that was something that I really did enjoy, especially being at Gren with the leaders that I had at the time. They were just so communicative and wanted me to understand like how intricate the organization was and how each of their roles really affected one another. And that helped me be even better in my role. So yeah, that's kind of how I got into talent acquisition specifically for software as a service. And I guess as far as it changing over the years, I would say it's gotten so much more competitive. Like, and I don't necessarily think that it's like hard. Like, I'm trying to articulate this. So there is a lot of opportunities, I would say, but there's such few individuals who have the experience that these companies really want. So something that I see is there's a lot of candidates that are trying to break into the market, or they were like, oh my gosh, this field is really blowing up like 8-9 years ago. And now they have their degrees and they're like ready to go, and they have some internships under their belt, but they're not at the level of like a Mollie Cox who's like has the
thank you.
And in all honesty, you probably were like the most aligned, like highly qualified, like exactly what they needed at Gren, like for product design. It was really hard finding someone who, because I was in charge of those roles, it was hard finding somebody who had the exact background. So you have people who want to get into it, but it's really tough finding people who are experienced in it already. Like that's something that I would say is like the toughest, being on the recruiting side. I'm trying to think as far as like on the candidate side.
One question for you. So the landscape being more competitive, it sounds like that can both make your job quote unquote easier and harder. Mm-hmm. Have you found like maybe you're having more candidates but less, I don't want to say quality, but less like specific expertise? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Oh yeah. I mean, I'm seeing that across every job order that I work. Really is like there's a ton of applicants, but finding the person who has the right experience and technology, and depending on the hiring manager I'm working with, sometimes they want, very specific industry background or very specific like leadership experience or like what have you. So there's always something that's like a non-negotiable for that manager, or something on the team that's lacking. So it might not necessarily be that the candidate's not, on paper the right fit, but it's like if they don't fit into what the team looks like already, that's something else that can also be a challenge to like find that too.
Could you say that? Do you wonder if like leaders who are looking for something specific are being too picky, or what's your feeling about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say it also depends what industry that you're supporting too, because I've supported software as a service, and now I'm supporting a company that they have kind of like a customer facing application, but that's not what they're selling, right? It's like a byproduct or like an enhancement of like your experience working with our organization. So I think it really does depend on that, like what they're applying to as well. Sorry, can you repeat the question? I want to make sure I'm like on the right track.
I was curious that if
they're being picky.
If they're being picky, I mean, it's more competitive. Mm-hmm. And so in my mind, I was thinking like, okay, that could be a good thing for a recruiter because you have all these candidates to pull from. But do you think that the competitive nature of the space is driving leaders to be more picky because they have more to pick from? And is that hurting them in the long run?
I would say it definitely has pros and cons. Like I said, there are a ton of applicants, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they align. Like usually it's going to be like they want to break it. That's the majority of the applicants that I see right now, or that they want to either totally make a shift in their career, which is like not uncommon. I feel like a lot of people try something for 5 to 10 years and then they're like, I can't do this for another 10, 15 years. So they're trying to, skirt and go to a different type of position. So I see a lot of those profiles, but unfortunately, again, the majority of the roles that I work are typically not entry level, or they're not even associate level. So usually they want someone who has prior experience, kind of been there, done that. So those are really tough to find, especially for these organizations that want someone who's, again, going to take a lateral move. It's like, that's tough on me as a recruiter, is like, what can we offer them that they don't already have, right? The flexibility, the pay, like there's so much more than just that. The team, like they're going to have to come here and have to learn everything all over again why would they make a lateral move for that? So like there's again pros and cons of both.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So there's so many things you just talked about that I want to break into. I want to talk about entry level because that is the hot topic. But before we get into some of these things, I think what's so important for people to realize, and what's missing a lot from the conversations I'm having with other people, seeing on LinkedIn, is really the hiring side perspective. I think so many perspectives that are going around right now is candidate side, and people are very, very frustrated, and with good cause, right? It is. We just said it's so competitive out there, and it's very, very difficult. Can you give the listeners just kind of an overview of? I know it looks different at every organization you're at, but what is that process a little bit like for you on your side from the actual recruiting perspective? How does that start, and how do you pull those candidates through?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I feel like I could talk the whole time about this. So I would say, as far as candidates applying into roles, like I have seen where, or I've even experienced, right? I live with a product designer. So
Which is amazing.
Sorry.
Hey.
So I've seen where it's like, hey, this job aligns so well for you, but he's like, my portfolio is not perfect. I can't apply. And it's like, I think it's important for candidates to know that when that job is posted, 9 times out of 10, they need to fill it like a month ago. Okay. Like it is like, it is critical. Yeah. Yep. And if I'm reaching out to you as a recruiter on LinkedIn Recruiter, because we have that access, and I'm like, hey, I'm pitching you this position. Are you interested? Your stuff does not have to be up to date. Like it really doesn't, because we know that I'm catching you off guard too. So like that's another side of it. But a lot of candidates, I think, wait until everything is like perfect, like absolutely perfect. And then they reach out and then they formulate. By that time, y'all, I'm already have like 3 people at the end of the
pipeline.
Row. Yeah. Yep. Like I already have 3 people in final interviews, which I'm not going to lie, when we had Fo, who I know y'all interviewed a couple weeks ago, when we saw Fo's resume come through, I was like, this is it. I was like,
get them in here. Yeah.
Right. So like we knew that was the right perfect fit. So like there are instances like that where someone is like later on in the game where they will just totally throw out whoever's left like that, but it's so rare. I mean, y'all know they're like incredible, you know what I mean? So like,
absolutely.
So, but it is so rare. But I would say, yeah, overall, it just kind of depends, like when they get into the process. And you also keep in mind that, just like I said, most of the roles that I've been at, I was put here because of someone I had worked with or someone that I knew. Referrals are huge. Like, so before a Recs even open, I typically, at most of the companies I've been at, have had people that are like, hey, someone on my team has worked with this person before. I want them to be prioritized. Or like, hey, I have, used to work with this other person at this other company, and they're a fantastic engineer, they're a fantastic product designer or product manager. I want them to be in the finalists. We can, and they'll make exceptions for those. Do I agree with that all the time? Not necessarily, because it doesn't necessarily mean it's an equitable process. Like I've seen that happen before, where they'll skip over my interviews, and I'm like, I don't even know what this person's asking for comp. Like, can we pay them?
Sometimes you don't have control over it, period, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So I would say, again, it really depends on like the managers that you're working with, how collaborative they are too with your recruiters. So I think some managers kind of see us as, which thank God I've never experienced this, but a lot of people see recruiters as like glorified assistant, executive assistants, where I'm just scheduling interviews. It's like, no, I really am partnering with you to like make sure this person's the right fit. And to do that, I want to make the process as equitable as possible. But I think candidates also, like the timing wise of like interviewing too can sometimes make things a little bit more prolonged as well. So like if I have a candidate who's like, I really am interested in this position, but I'm going on a 2-week vacation and I won't have time to, and I'm like, by then I usually, especially in software as a service organizations, we move so fast that role is probably going to be pretty far along to an offer by the time that person gets back and actually starts interviewing. So I think that's another thing too, is like candidates who are a bit more passive in their search tend to take a little bit more of their time and be more lax, where like that doesn't necessarily get them ahead, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
I've seen kind of all over the board candidates in all types of situations, but yeah, I would say the biggest thing that I see is just the lack of like sense of urgency, whether it's on like the candidate side or even like the hiring manager side too. But you have to find that sweet spot. And as a Libra, I'm all about the balance. So it works out.
The scales. So,
Yeah.
okay, we've talked about entry level, which I want to talk about again. And now you just, there's another topic that you brought up that you just mentioned. But before we even get into that one, I actually want to give my perspective of working with recruiters as well. So we just, from two different sides. So, Rachel, you said you kind of jumped in and applied at Gren, and then all of a sudden you found yourself a job. So, funny story, I have to tell you that at the organization I was at right before, I, I know we all find ourselves in this position where we rage apply sometimes, right? Have a really bad day at work, and you're like, I'm applying to all the jobs that I can see today, right? But I was in this very specific area where I was looking for something new, and I happened to see Gren come across the boards, and I feel like this is a very rare circumstance. I knew no one there, because referrals is the other topic I want to talk about. I knew no one there. I knew it was this long shot in the dark, and I was like, you know what? Whatever, screw it. I'm gonna apply. Sure as shit, a couple days later, I hear from Rachel, and I'm like, what? Like, I didn't even expect anything like this, right? But previously I said Rachel's a badass, and let me tell you why. Because I've worked with a lot of different recruiters in my career, from both the hiring manager perspective and from the candidate perspective. Rachel, one of the things that you did, and I see missing so much today, and you just went through a job search yourself. I would love to hear about the ghosting, what you experience. Empathy is such a huge aspect of the recruiting process that I think candidates oftentimes forget how stressful it is for the recruiters. But you provided me clarity. You laid it out. You said, this is our full process. This is what you can expect. This is exactly who you're going to meet on our first email. And it was like, what? Like, this is amazing. But through that full process, and we all know that interviewing processes can have many layers and many steps, I was always informed. You always kept me up to date. Funny story, Claire, there was a moment where I got sent a Zoom link. Do you remember this, Rachel? I got sent a Zoom link, and it didn't work. It was broken, and I couldn't get in. So I started messaging all the interviewers on LinkedIn. I was like, can you give me a password? And they finally did. But Rachel was on the phone with me directly after. But it's just that empathy and communication that you had with me through the whole process. And a lot of the conversation that I feel right now is happening is how that is missing and lacking in recruiting today. What was your experience like in the last, in like several months? And has it changed how you will operate a little bit? Because you're already operating awesome. What are those areas in which it would change?
Yeah, I think that's a big issue, right? And why I think candidates are so opinionated on what's right or wrong or how we should do it, like as recruiters, or how talent acquisition should proceed. But there is no like unanimous process for anything recruiting, anything hiring. Like there isn't. Just like in product, right? Scrum, there's like a framework that everyone tries to work within. There's nothing like that in talent acquisition. So a lot of these companies that I had been applying to, I was like, y'all need me like to put some automation emails or some follow-up or something, some kind of communication with the candidates. Like you just submit a resume and you don't ever hear anything like at all. Like that's insane to me. Or after I interview, there's no follow-up. Or like I rejected one of my offers and I sent over saying I didn't think it was ethical to take it on. It was like a big thing. And I didn't even hear a follow up. Like I, at least as a recruiter, would be like, thank you for letting me know. Like, I think you should do what's best for you. Like, this is your career, your life. Like, at least follow up and acknowledge that the person's like reaching out, and like trying to be communicative. Like, I value that in a candidate so much. Like, obviously we have candidates who over communicate, which I don't need that necessarily every day. But it is nice to, to keep in touch and understand where someone's coming from, because that also for me gauges if I know if a candidate is going to accept an offer, or if they're not going to accept. Like, that is part of my job. But yeah, as far as the last couple of months, it was horrifying really to see how the lack of transparency, like you said, just not knowing, like, is this my last interview? How many more interviews am I gonna have? Like, what's the process look like? Like, who all am I meeting with and why? Like, why do I have to meet with someone who's like in a department I'm not even supporting, right? Like, there's a lot of that. Or it's like just bringing stuff on you, like, oh, hey, we also have this assessment we want you to take. It's like, oh my God, like, I was really excited about this job, but now I'm not. Because there's like, because if this is how it is, if this is the experience before I'm even hired, like, why would I want to work with you guys? Like, y'all are so unorganized. Like, that is something that I take so personally. And I think that's also just like part of my own brand with when working with candidates, is like just that open line of communication is so critical. But I know it is really rare. Like, you're not the first one to tell me that I'm a good recruiter, because there are a lot of people that are like, wow, you know the job way more than I thought you would, or like, wow, you can really speak to the organization and the projects that they're working on. But that's important to me as a just in my job, you know what I mean? I don't think a lot of recruiters go above and beyond for that. And I also don't think, especially with the volume that we're seeing of applicants, like, it is impossible to give people feedback of why they're not selected, or, you know, it really is, because otherwise I'm not doing my job of what the company hired me to do. I'm just trying to get back to everyone who's not a match, which is like 90% of people that apply in is like not going to align. And then I need to invest my time for the person that I work for, which is my hiring manager and my company, to make sure that I'm finding the right person. So I need to invest that time on LinkedIn Recruiter and talking to candidates and having genuine conversations with people who actually are aligned. So it, again, is that it's a balance. But I also feel a need where, for me, I always reply back to candidates if they're even reaching out for like an update within 48 hours, because I'm like, that's not that hard to reply back and be like, I don't have an update, or like, hey, I'm still waiting on the hiring manager, I will call you, you know, kind of thing. Like, it's not that hard. So when I see these horror stories on LinkedIn, I'm like, how have these people done so well? How have some of these companies like Figma done so well hiring people when you don't even communicate with them in the interview process? Like, how are they still interested in working for you after 10, 15 rounds of interviews and 2 months, 3 months later? It's like, what? Like, that blows my mind.
Yeah, it seems like oftentimes recruiters, or maybe even some people in the HR departments, like, forget that you are the first touch point with candidates. Now, whether or not they're going to get hired or not, like, you are the first impression of the company. And that really, that can really set you up for success or set you up for failure. Maybe a candidate has a bad experience, you're not going to hire them. But maybe a candidate who you really want to hire has a bad experience and they're not going to join your company. So it's important for people to remember that you are the first impression, or recruiters to remember that
you're the brand.
Absolutely. That's such a great point, Claire, because I've had people who were like, who turned down a job with us. RIP, the guy who was at Pendo, who I like was dying to get at Gren. Okay, but he recommended so many people to me after that who were highly qualified just like him. So I was like, oh, lesson learned. Like, but that is so true.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about kind of entry level, if we can go back to that just a little bit, because it's across the board. It's not only, so many people are trying to break into tech right now, right? And from a product management standpoint, from a design standpoint, we get y'all. I have my last roles I have posted for product designers. Within a week, I will get well over 1,000 applications. It is so hard right now, and so many people are trying to break into the industry. So especially in design, Claire, maybe you have more insight, and Rachel, you have more insight to the product management side. But of course, the whole discussion is portfolios right now. How do we get the portfolios? But there's so many steps before a recruiter actually looks at a portfolio, which is a whole nother thing. But there's just so much anger right now I'm seeing out there. And a lot of that is because there's so much entry level positions available. But what I'm finding is companies are cutting budgets. Maybe I'm wrong. This is how I'm viewing it. Companies are cutting budgets, where we're seeing a landscape with so many layoffs. We're cutting the volume of people down. And so therefore, when roles open, so often they have to be that more senior role because
Mhm.
the sheer volume of people working within that department is lower. And so they need somebody to come in and hit that ground running. Rachel, how much are you seeing entry level positions available? How do you vet that out? And
Hmm.
how do you know when is the right time to bring the right candidate up who looks promising but may not have the full experience? It's a whole can of worms.
Such a good question. uh Again, I'm just going to go back to the amount of candidates that we have applying in, right? These recent grads and people who want a career transition, they're competing against people who are not happy where they are, who don't like their manager, who may not like the team environment. They want to be remote. Like there's a plethora of reasons why people leave where they are, but they're competing with those same people. So even though it's like an entry level job, as with most companies, they're going to prefer someone who has some experience under their belt with the tech, with the, working cross functionally. If you're a designer, have you worked with engineers? Do you understand how to use Jira? Like, how do you use it like professionally? So there's a lot of nice to haves that slowly become requirements when you have that many applications to get through. So I would say for candidates who are looking for true entry level roles, they're really going to have to lean in on a professional network or finding mentors in that space. And I mean, I was like one of those people too. That's kind of how I got into what I've gotten into, and really how I've advanced in my career has been through people I've worked with or people I've networked with, or, so I would just say that's probably the way to get a foot in the door. And getting a foot in the door is not through an external recruiter. I feel like so many candidates think that working with a staffing firm is going to get them in the door at a client company. It's not. Like, and I will fight whoever wants to fight me on that. But it is usually those roles are just, they've had a hard time filling them and they haven't found the right person. So it's really tough to like work with entry level candidates who are, if you're an external recruiter. As an internal recruiter, I do have a little bit more flexibility, to your point, Molly, where I can advocate for the candidates, which I love, love, love that aspect of being internal, where it's like, hey, this person's an excellent communicator. They have product experience from working, on this internship with this particular company. They were wearing many hats and they just really found that their niche is product management or product design. And I think that you should at least talk to them and understand their thought process, especially for product designers. Like, I feel like that's like half of the battle is like, how do you think? How do you communicate? How much empathy do you have for the end user? Like all these things are like, yes, you learn them in school, but like to actually practice them and have a passion for it, like that comes out in an interview. You know what I mean? So like, those are some instances where I have pushed candidates through where I'm like, this person has their master's degree. They might not have the 3 years experience that this other person has who also has a bachelor's, or sometimes even at Gren, we didn't even care if they had a degree or not, So it was like really just talking to candidates and getting a gauge for like, are you also going to collaborate? Are you collaborative to like want to work with cross-functionally with our team, and like, are you open to feedback? How much, like, their desire to learn, like all of that stuff, their aptitude, right, are all things that we would consider as well. So it's not just like, do you have the right experience or do you not have the experience? There's so much more to that. I think it just also it's again very dependent on the recruiter that you get and how invested they are in really getting to know that candidate and like what they want, and is it something that we can give them, you know what I mean? So it's kind of like, and again, I know all recruiters are not like me, so a lot of them are very stoic and don't really understand like the role, or their companies are just so scared to get sued by the interview process that they don't allow them to show personality and like really get to know the candidates. But I make a point to do that, and I usually like meeting people on camera because you can better gauge that, especially if you're remote. Just to really make sure that I'm like doing my due diligence and finding the right person for the position and for that team and for the manager.
Yeah. Yeah, that entry level is so hard. And I love how you say like you can feel the passion in
Mm-hmm.
people. right? And I think there's so many different reasons people are trying to break into tech right now. And in the design community, we do have the conversation quite a bit about what we're seeing is a lack of passion start coming through, right? Because I just want to be in tech and I feel like designers make a lot of money. So I'm going to gravitate towards that one, or I'm going to, and I'm not saying it all comes down to that, but that lack of passion is really starting to be seen. I'm going to tell you guys a little story that just happened to me literally yesterday. Okay. And I'm seeing a lot of frustration, a lack of passion, and just callousness from candidates. And Rachel, I want to hear from your perspective a little bit on candidate attitudes that you're feeling coming through. Because right now, I have had a hard time going on LinkedIn. People are angry. Well, anyway, I went into a group on another social media platform, and someone was posting about, anonymous, of course, was posting about how now in the application process, there's all these questions that you have to answer. And they were basically like, I am not answering a 300-word essay. I'm not going to do these things. So I was like, you know what? I'm going to jump in, give them the hiring manager perspective, and I basically told them, and Rachel, you can attest, and Claire, you've been through the process, so there are so many stages to vetting, right? And if you're being asked questions right off the bat in that interview process, that is your first step of vetting. I just said earlier, there are thousands of applications that come in for design, for product management. This is a way for us to, before we even look at that portfolio that you have spent hundreds of hours working on, I want to see that you are serious and experienced with the questions that you answer. It's how we get into actually click in and look at your information more thoroughly. So anyway, I try to explain this, and somebody says, well, if there's questions, I just write, we'll answer an interview. And I was like, well, that's the quickest way to get a decline, right? Frankly, if you want to do that, go for it, but as a hiring manager, I read all of them that get sent my way. And if it says that, it's like, well, if you can't take the time to fill that out, I guess you don't want it how badly do you want it? Right?
I mean, I think you could squash that, Molly, and ask the person, how's that working for you?
Yeah. Well, obviously not well, because they were very mad. So I put this very thoughtful post, very thoughtful. They proceed to tell me I don't know how to hire, how I should be hiring. And it's a joke, basically. And I was like, wow, whoa, okay. If that's the attitude you want to have and that's how you want to be, that's great. That's on you. If you follow the process you want to follow, I'm trying to help you figure out how to get to the next stage.
For sure.
But it's these attitudes, it is just like, as a candidate, you have to remember, I understand that you're frustrated, but you are still talking to people who are hiring. You are still talking to recruiters. Rachel, I'm sure you go and looked at LinkedIn for every candidate that you look at and get serious about. You can see their posts, you can see their comments, you can see how they're behaving online, right?
Absolutely.
So in your perspective, I was just very I ended up deucing out of the group. I was like, I am not here for this negativity. I am out, grab my glass of wine, and I am moving on. But from that recruiting standpoint, are you seeing this frustration and this I'm not even articulating the right words correctly, but just this attitude and this air of frustration come through?
Absolutely. And I think it goes back to how you're not hearing a lot of the passion anymore in people's interview process, because they are so exhausted from how much rejection that they're getting. So I also try to put that into perspective from my seat as okay, maybe again, we just talked about my experience trying to find a job and how little response I got. When you finally get a response from a human being and it's a recruiter like me, and it's a rejection notice, or it's saying, thanks for applying, keep in touch if you want, and they take all that out on me, it is I try to not take it personally, which earlier, if you would have told me, I thought I could tell my old self 7 years ago, don't take that personally. It's hard not to, whenever it's you're trying to do your best to, again, communicate and to be professional and follow up and these things, but they do tend to take a lot out on us, as the messenger, basically. But yeah, that attitude, I have seen offers rescinded from candidates who a quick little Google search and with their name, and it comes up that they were flicking off someone in traffic, or, swerve. Literally one in Charlotte was like, she was swerving. It was like a CPA that I heard, and she was like swerving into traffic into like these bikers. It was like a half marathon or something, or some kind of marathon. And so they were like, absolutely not. We don't want to be associated with that. So like I've definitely seen offers rescinded just from how people behave outside of a professional setting. And you really get to see people's true colors and how they treat you. And honestly, when people reply back nasty to those emails, like those rejection emails, a lot of times, especially in roles that I've worked, we will put you in our system as do not contact in the future, and like, or proceed with caution if I follow up with you. Let's say you're a finalist for a role and you get really nasty about not being the one selected and really aggressive with me. Like, that's a big red flag to us, is like being able to handle stuff gracefully and professionally. Like, at the end of the day, I have no control over it either. It wasn't my choice if someone was picked or not. So I'm just, again, relaying that. So sometimes it makes me a little bit more cautious to work with that person in the future as well. So I would say definitely people need to be a little bit more mindful of the stuff that they're posting online. Like, obviously I post a lot online, and it's like who I am and my brand, and I'll stand firm to that. But there are certain things that I'm like, ooh, that's not cute. Like, you should not be posting that, or like saying that kind of stuff, or like probably even stuff that you like on LinkedIn is shown that you liked it to everybody. So it's like, even if you don't repost it, if you liked it, it's something that will show up, and it's like, oh, you want to be associated with that, like something that's like homophobic or like anti-women, like, you know what I mean? It's like, y'all really need to be checking yourselves a little bit more online, because companies really do look at that, especially on the HR side. Like, I've had candidates get through like a hiring manager interview, like through a hiring manager, and then someone in HR is like, hey, like, we communicate with HR and say, hey, we might have this candidate, onboarding or whatever, coming close to an offer, and they'll start looking into people's social medias too, because a lot of that is public. And so I think people forget, like, hey, who I am behind closed doors, like, does impact my job search sometimes.
I think this is a good segue, tee up, like, where do you see candidates fail the most? One, online presence.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned communication, like being a poor sport if you don't get the job. What are some other like big time, where are candidates getting it wrong?
So I do want to make a point to say, like, I do feel for candidates, like, a lot, like, especially when it's like they have put in time with us to interview, and they really were excited about getting hired. And the more that they go through the interview process, the more not just excited, but the more involved they are, and the more effort they put into their interview process. Like, it's a lot of work, and I understand that applying for a job and interviewing for a job is literally a full-time job on its own.
Yeah.
Like,
Well, and at the end of
it's
the day,
hard.
there's only one candidate that gets
Exactly.
through, right? Yeah.
Exactly. But I would say a big thing, apart from just the attitudes and the negativity, and like there is a lack of empathy, I think, for our seats, and also for the hiring manager seats, where like we do have so many people applying for the role, and a lot of referrals, and lots of people who show interest, and we try to get through everybody. Like, I am probably one of the few recruiters that I know who like actually will go through all 400 resumes, or I will literally look at every single profile that comes through, because I want to do my due diligence. Maybe that 395 is the one who's like our person, you know what I mean? So like, I really make an effort to, but I know a lot of recruiters don't, or they're like, hey, once you get 100 resumes, just close the job order. And I'm like, why? Like, I want to make sure that I like find the right person. So I would say for candidates, where they probably are falling short, or where they're making mistakes, would probably be either waiting too long to apply for the job, they're annoying the hiring manager or the recruiter way too much, and too much touch base.
Yeah.
That is a thing.
Yep.
So you got, again, that balance. I would say another thing is just not being aligned to the role, and then really trying to advocate for yourself that you are aligned to the role is frustrating on our end, because it's like, no, these are like the non-negotiables that we're looking for, and you don't have that particular software, you don't have that particular. They're like, well, I studied it in school, or like, I've read about it, it's like, but I've had other candidates who actually have used that technology before. That also makes me think of why so many companies do not give feedback to candidates anymore, because there is so much pushback and there is so much, it's very combative whenever it comes to, well, I am, or I have done that, or you didn't hear me right, or you didn't let me elaborate, or the interview process was too short, or it was too long, or what, I was repeating myself. I said that in a prior interview. Like, there's a lot of that. And so I think, again, lawsuits and all these other things come up when in the recruiting process, and why you're starting to see less and less communication from the recruiting team. And that's why. So it's literally like a twofold thing. It's like the candidates are the problem, but also the companies are the problem. So it's like this back and forth. And again, I think it goes back to just not having like a unanimous, this is the process for recruiting. There's literally nothing like that, like globally, or even like country to country. There's no standard operating procedure on what's right or wrong and how to recruit. So I have always taken a lot of pride in giving people feedback, and it drives me nuts that I'm not able to sometimes for certain roles, but that's what we're trying to avoid. I'm trying to think where else candidates go wrong at. I feel like cover letters like don't even bother really. Like I've had people apply to roles that I've seen recently at my new job where they'll only put a cover letter in, and it will just say, I've done this, this, and this. Interview me and I'll tell you more. And I'm like, what? Like, I have to present a resume to a manager to review of where you've been, the technologies that you've highlighted. And that's something else too, is like highlighting the right stuff that aligns with the role. Like I've had people apply for jobs that have nothing to do with the role, but then when I get them on, they're like, oh, please interview me, like, and I'm like, okay, I have the extra time, which is rare, but I have the extra time. But sometimes I'll try to get to people that are maybes, and then they'll really elaborate. I'm like, why don't you have any of this on your resume? Like, that's really crazy. I'm trying to think.
I think too, like you said, there's something else that's happening too. Not over communicating with the hiring manager or the recruiter, but watch how many people you reach out to within the organization for a referral. That's happening so much right now. Like, oh, I'm just going to message 18 people, try to talk to them, and then see if they'll give me a referral into the organization.
And with that, we still, as part of our documentation, we still ask, hey, have you worked with this person before? Do you know this person personally, professionally? And if they're like, no, they just reach out to me on LinkedIn, you're not really a true referral. Like, you're just an applicant at that point. And like, we make a note of that. Like, we're not stupid. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah. And that's what I try to tell. Sorry, Claire. That's what I try to tell them too. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, what about like in the actual interview process, like how you're answering questions? Have you seen any just like, have you seen a candidate who's like great on paper and they get into the interview process and maybe they're not prepared, or maybe they're nervous, or what are some of the like interview faux pas?
Oh, for sure. Not having any clue what the company does is so frustrating. I'm like, you didn't even look at our website, or they're like reading the website as I'm talking to them, like verbatim off of the website. I'm like, so you didn't do any research on what we do or who we are, nothing, what our culture is, anything like that. And what else? Oh yeah. Also, I interviewed a communications manager, and he, for 20 minutes, taught, like, I was like, hey, can you give me a brief rundown of how you've ended up in a management seat? They talked 20 minutes about their whole career trajectory. It was so boring. I literally, my boyfriend
in a 30-minute screen, I'm sure, right?
Yes. Yeah. And my boyfriend was like, wow, that guy's boring. I was like, oh my goodness.
But over talking is real. Keep it succinct, because I'm also watching how you're going to, like, from a design perspective, how are you going to communicate to stakeholders? How are you going to get your idea across? How are you going to take 2 minutes and give me the main idea? And if you can't do that there, I will move on.
Yeah, right? That actually, sorry. I was going to say, it brings up a good point too, because sometimes this is a big mistake I see a lot of engineering and product candidates do, even cybersecurity, is like, they overcomplicate their experience to a recruiter. And I'm not a cybersecurity professional. I'm not an engineer. Like, I live with a designer, and that's for the last 10 years. And that's basically why I think I'm better than most product recruiters, is because I've literally hear about it nonstop all day, every day. So like, I have that exposure, but it's super rare that you're talking to someone in HR or somebody who actually understands that complexity, that technology, the really deep like details, and the like all the acronyms. I'm like, what does that even mean? Like, that's something else where I think candidates really go wrong, is like assuming that the recruiter knows like what all these things are. The more simplified that they can make it, if you can put it in layman's terms what you do, those are chef's kiss, like best recruiters, or sorry, best candidates, because that means that you're going to be able to communicate cross-functionally with all different types of teams, regardless of their level or their expertise. You can communicate those technical, pieces to people who are not non-technical. And that is like literally the majority of the roles, especially in software as a service. That's so critical. And that's another thing too that I see a lot on resumes as well, is just like all this jargon. And I'm like, what did you do? Like, what have you done?
So that brings up two
Yeah.
things for me. So first and foremost, the infamous cover letter. Is it read? This is the big debate now too. How much time do I spend on it? Is it actually read? But then secondly, when you're in that process and you get that human being and you get that phone screen, what are you looking for in that phone screen? If you're not the technical one and you're that first step,
Mm-hmm.
and let's not go too deep on acronyms, I'm not cybersecurity, I'm not these things, then what are you wanting candidates to highlight in that initial phone screen?
Who they are. I want to know like about you. Like, I think a lot of people separate their work from their personality and stuff, and like personality is huge. Y'all work with these people every day. Like, that's something I gauge too, is like, is this someone that I would want to work with? Like, do I want to communicate with this person every day and like collaborate with them? Like, are they not necessarily entertaining? Because I have a lot of engineering candidates who are very heads down and very quiet, and I'm like, I have to meet them there because my personality is like woof, like way up there. So I think it just really goes back to it's not just on paper, do you align with the job? It's so much more than that. It's like, we evaluate culture fit, we evaluate a lot of like communication, how do they communicate, how well, and like, especially the questions that are like, give me an example of how you did X, Y, and Z. Those really gauge for us how you handle challenges, how you bounce back, like resilience, perseverance, and a lot of times, how quickly can you pick up something, like, so a lot of those things are evaluated in those those like initial screening questions. And I also think especially on the technical side, I would always ask my hiring manager, what are 3 questions that I can ask that I know if someone's not a match? Like, because I don't want to move people forward in the process, waste their time and my manager's time. Like, that doesn't make any sense. So a lot of times I'll be like, well, ask them what they've done in Figma, ask them how much they use Jira, or like, ask them about a time that they had to work with the triangle, right? Like product managers, engineers, and design, like how well do they collaborate? Who is the leader in that? You know what I mean? Or like, does their how truly product company are they? You know what I mean?
You bring up a really good point, like little side shout out, especially in the design community. And Claire, maybe in product management with tools like Product Board and stuff, but in product design, it's all Figma every day, all day. And it's like, y'all, Jira, learn Jira. You need to get familiar with that program and that platform, because that is the guiding light for all product and engineering teams. Right. Mm-hmm. And so many people don't have experience there. So little side note there. But regarding personality, one of my very, very good friends who we've actually had on the show, he used to say, from a hiring manager perspective, and he would tell the recruiter, would I be able to have a 12-hour layover in an airport with this person? So I think that's a really good rule of thumb, right? If our plane got stuck and we had a 12-hour layover, could I sit in an airport with this individual?
Yeah, that's amazing. I love that. Yeah. I had one of my managers says, well, I want to get a beer with this person. Like, do I want to hang out and do an offsite with this person?
Yeah. And we're not saying like I need a best friend, right? That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is, do we mesh? Will they work with the team? Will they work with me? There's a lot to be said for that. Mm-hmm. Which is why I think referrals is such a big deal, right? A lot of times, referrals that come from inside companies, you've worked in the organization, you know the culture of the organization, and having just by nature worked with another individual, you'll know if they're going to be a match or a fit in that company, right? So we mentioned referrals earlier, and I said I was going to come back around to it. Here we are. This is going to be hard to hear and hard to say, but it is the reality. Over the last year, from what month are we even in right now? September. So last July to September right now, I have hired, I believe, around 17 designers. Okay. That's a big
Wow, that's a
portion.
big, that's a
Yeah.
lot.
Yeah. Of those 17, I will tell you right now, 16 were referrals.
Wow.
16 of them. Okay.
Mm.
Now, I say that because networking is essential. And especially if you're an entry level candidate coming in right now, you have to go into the community, meet other product managers, meet other product operations individuals, really start to learn people in the industry. This is a small world, right?
Yeah.
Like as big as tech is, it is also a very small world. A lot of hiring managers know each other, recruiters, we know each other all over the place. But as you just said, Rachel, earlier, sometimes even from the recruiting standpoint, that referral comes in, you don't even have a choice. They jump forward, and there's something to be said for a hiring manager prospecting, vouching on someone's word and trusting an individual or an employee that you already have. And that knowing if they're going to recommend this person, they're worth looking at.
For sure.
So how, I don't exactly know, other than networking and making sure you're involved, how you kind of combat that from a candidate side. It's a tough reality to face, and that's where we are as an industry right now. But what advice would you give to anyone right now about being a referral, getting referrals, and just how they tackle that?
Be patient, because I was that person for the last 4 months where I had a huge network of people that I've hired for, been working with, would refer me, did refer me. Like, I had so many people in my network who were like, I'm keeping an eye out. I've put your resume in front of my manager. Like, we don't have a need. Like, be patient, like, really and truly, I would say, apart from doing all the things that you just listed. But also on the other side of it is, just because you're a referral does not mean that you're going to get an interview. It doesn't mean that you
1000%.
will, it doesn't mean that you will get the job. Like, again, you're competing. If the company is being equitable and they want to see outside candidates and they're letting their internal team apply for inward mobility, internal mobility, which I think is equally important, giving their current employees opportunities too, they're gonna also be right alongside other people competing for the job. So just because you're a referral, and honestly, sometimes, like, I've had my hiring managers interview people and they didn't know that they were a referral, and just because maybe they overlooked it in the system or on my notes or something, but they're like, why is this person in the process? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I'm like, so that's something else that I've learned, is just to not push people forward just because they are referrals. I want to do what's best by the company, by the hiring manager I'm supporting, and not waste anybody's time.
Absolutely. And I want to give a little more color to what I just said, because you bring up a good point in that. While most of the individuals I have hired have been referrals, I want to be very clear. Even the last role I hired for, I had 6 referrals for that one role.
Wow.
So it's not like I just had one referral come through.
Yeah.
And it was a very cutthroat, difficult, phenomenal candidates. It was a really tough
Wow.
problem, actually. It came down to 2 people, and it was like, literally, I could flip a coin and either one is going to be brilliant and come in and kill it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I spent days like trying to figure out, like, what are we going to do here, right? So it's not just a matter of, to your point, just because you're a referral doesn't mean you're going to go through. And just because you're a referral, don't think that there's not more. Right.
Right.
So, and just because you're a referral doesn't make you the right fit. So when I say that most of the individuals I've hired have been referrals, it's because there's so much availability right now. There's so many people looking.
Yeah.
And it's just how everything has fallen in my world right now.
Mm-hmm. I would say it's definitely more prominent on the software as a service industry. Like, for sure. It's way more competitive. In my perspective, way more competitive. And if you're applying, that's something else I think is important to highlight for candidates who are trying to break into it. If you're applying to a software as a service company and you don't have any prior experience, you're competing with very, very niche candidates who are like, they have the industry, they have the software, been there, done that. So it is very competitive, but I think they have a little bit better of a chance if they're applying to a company that maybe they have IoT, maybe it's like my company where it's like a customer facing portal, but that's not their like core product where they make their money, but it's a good way to like get in it and kind of get exposure to a variety of things.
So one question I have is, I think it is so competitive, but the fact still remains that it could take a really long time for you to get a job. And so I like being in that process of applying and not being able, and like, it sometimes takes a long time. What do you do to like keep your nerves at bay? Is there something proactive that candidates can do to and Mollie, maybe this is a question for you, that designers can do that while they're waiting and applying, like what can they be doing in the meantime when they're looking for a job that's not applying to jobs?
Well, I'll let Rachel take the first crack at that, but I do have my thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, any kind of like courses online are always good. I also highly recommend like reaching out to companies and being like, do you need an intern? Like, I'm willing to work. Like, I need exposure. I can commit, even if it's unpaid. Like, which, let's be honest, a lot of companies were like, I could always use extra help, but I can't pay you. Like, that is some exposure. And then also, you're getting great referrals who are actually in those jobs that they can speak to your experience. I don't necessarily love that they're not being paid for working, but again, that's how I started in my career. I did not get paid for any of my internships. But I also feel like just doing things that help you like emotionally and mentally, so all that aggression isn't coming out in your interviews. Like it really shows when someone's frustrated in their interview process, if they're angry at the interview process, they're blaming their prior company, if they speak negatively a lot of their prior company that they were at, like, oh, I was laid off and screw them kind of thing. Like it is so, but that is so common that you hear that, but it's like, that's not something you need to be sharing with a recruiter, or it does not need to be coming out in your interview process. So if they can do other things in their life, outside of, outside of work, that they can release that's a big thing that I would recommend.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more there. A lot of the mentees that I've talked with are just so focused on the job and get so stressed and so much anxiety. And it's a full-time, you said it earlier, it's a full-time job finding a job, but you have to step away. You have to give yourself the grace to know that something will come up, something will happen. You have to walk away just for your own mental sanity sometimes, right? But I think also from that design perspective, we just literally talked about it. It's not just about learning tools. It's not just about how good can I get in Figma, but it's about that networking too. It's about really digging into the community and finding those people in the community and taking someone out for coffee, learning for someone. There's always product management, agile design groups in almost every city. Join them, go to those meetings.
I love that. Yeah, and following subject matter experts on LinkedIn and not people who have opinions of stuff they've never done. Which there's a lot of that.
So to wrap us up, Rachel, I mean, I could go. We're gonna have to schedule a part 2 on this because I could keep going. But to sum it up, we've talked a lot about the candidates, but I also want to know from your perspective today, having seen what you've seen, what advice would you give to companies and other recruiters right now to get better at their process?
So much.
Is that another episode? Did I just highlight the next episode?
My God. Okay. I mean, just communicate and tell people what is going on in their interview process. That should all be sussed out before you even talk to the first candidate. What's the budget? Who's meeting this candidate? Why are they even involved? Like, why are you having them meet this person and this person? Can this be one interview? Can it be 2? Why does it have to be 3 separate interviews? Why? So like, I think that's something that a lot of recruiters don't do, is they are order takers, like, oh, okay, you need this, you need that. Okay, I'll do that. Instead of being collaborative and like, you're going to lose candidates if your interview process is this long. Like, I'm not going to be able to find somebody who has all of the above. Like, where's the wiggle room? What is the non-negotiables and what's something that we can teach them, you know? So I think just being more consultative with your hiring team and really collaborating with your recruiters, I think that's where I have found is like my sweet spot of like finding candidates who are exactly what we need in like less than 60 days, like usually like 40 days. And I love being able to say that like I've had a lot of success because of those partnerships and relationships that I've had with my hiring managers.
Awesome. Well, again, Rachel, don't be surprised if in your inbox you see a part 2 invitation from Claire and I. It would also be incredible to do potentially live with people on LinkedIn and cool. Get some engagement there and just really be able to answer people's questions on the spot. So look out for that. We may want to do that as well. However, we're going to wrap it up for today. We could go on and on, but Rachel, I am so thankful for you joining us on the show today. And I know Claire, I didn't even give you that much crap today. And I'm a little disappointed in myself.
Me too. I was ready for it.
Were you ready for it?
Yeah.
In your head, you've already worked out like comebacks even before we started.
I'll save them for later. Don't worry.
I'm sure you will. I have no doubt. So, but again, Rachel, thank you so much. And we really enjoyed you on the show today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning into this week's episode. If you enjoyed it, be sure to subscribe and leave a 5-star review on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts.
And if you'd like to connect with us, check out our website at bouncepodcast.com.